What's up, everybody? Today we're talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the Reboot comic, issue 3. Before we get into it, I did want to just quickly plug a new podcast I've got called Gilville, Gilville. You can find it on the Apple Podcast app. Check it out. Now, coming out of issue 2 of Buffy, I'm still enjoying the series. It's doing a good job of prioritizing characters over action. It's funny. I feel like all the voices from the characters as they were on the show are being properly represented here. There were two things that I was a little worried about coming into issue 3. One of them is the pacing and the sort of comic booky introductions we've had for some of these characters. For example, the character Spike showed up in issue 2, and how was he introduced? Cordelia walked into the woods, and he was standing there. It felt a little bit like we want to shoehorn in every character you remember from the show, and sometimes those introductions aren't all that creative. So I was a little worried we'd get more of that in issue 3. The other thing I was worried about going into issue 3 is a little bit more specific, and that's Xander. I was a big fan of his character in the show, and in the comic, so far, they've been showing him to be sort of sad, lonely, depressed, and I don't have a problem with that. The whole point of the series is to look at the trials and tribulations of these high school students. A lot of kids are dealing with that, not that I would know from experience, but I felt like they're laying it on a little bit thick. Like, not every scene has to focus on that aspect of his character. And the other thing that concerns me about it is I feel a little bit like they might be setting him up for a villainous role. That he feels so dejected that at some point he might feel like he needs to do something a little bit crazy. And I just wouldn't want to see that from Xander, but we'll keep an eye out for it. Going into issue 3, I'll say that those two concerns I had from the last issue weren't as present this time around. I think what helped is that at this point, a lot of the characters have been introduced. So there's less of a, hey, check it out, remember this character from the show? And because of that, this issue might have been my favorite of the 3, if not for the fact that even though there were fewer in-your-face character introductions this time around, there were a couple of pacing issues towards the end of the issue, which I'll talk about more in my spoiler review. To get into that a little bit more, the comics that I enjoy least are the ones that are overstuffed with too much action and things move so quickly you can hardly keep up with what's going on, and character development, relationship building, all that stuff gets deprioritized. I would say Buffy right now is doing a fantastic job of avoiding that issue. The comic tends to take its time and, like I said earlier, focus on character above all else. Generally, that's what the comic does, but there were a couple points this issue where I started to see the limitations of the real estate in a 20 or so page comic. There were just a few things that felt like they could have used a little more room to breathe, specifically around some of Buffy's interactions with Giles and with Cordelia. I'd say, without getting into spoilers, the bottom line is that if you enjoyed issue 1 or issue 2 of this series, you'll enjoy issue 3. It's got more of the humor, more of the character building, and if you were a fan of the show like I was, it's hard not to love the series. You basically get to have your cake and eat it too. It's new Buffy stories, but they take place in the time period that I enjoyed most, which was Buffy in high school. One thing I'm curious about is how a non-Buffy fan would react to this comic. It's sold as a reboot, it's a fresh story, but I feel like I'm bringing a lot of pre-knowledge to the story. If you were reading this as someone unfamiliar with Buffy and her universe of characters, would it feel like too many characters being introduced at once? When I say that generally it paces itself well and takes its time, would a non-Buffy fan feel like it's overwhelming, like too many concepts and characters are being introduced at once? Curious to know, but at least me personally, I'm loving the series, and I can't wait to see issue 4, which comes out April 4th. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that little bell icon so you get notifications whenever we come out with a new video. And if you read the comic, then make sure to check out my full spoiler review where I go into a lot more detail than what we talked about here. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to check out Gillville on the Apple Podcast app or whichever podcast app you use. That's Gillville, Gilville. If you enjoy these videos, I think you'll love that podcast.